Hi everyone. Today we're talking about O'Neill Chapter 2 on the state. And we've talked a little bit about what the state is, but this is going to be sort of a systematic discussion of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about the state, which is the basic unit of analysis that we use in comparative politics and international relations, so in international politics in general. And so here's the question I want you to think about during this lecture. How is the United States different from ISIS or the mob? And so you should be able to justify your answer using information from the reading and the following terms: politics, regime, state, government, country, nation. Hopefully the answer to this will become clear as we have this discussion today. What is it, other than sort of this gut reaction that of course it's different, what is it that makes the United States government different from ISIS or the mob should be something that you can answer analytically using these terms. So if you remember last time we talked about what is politics, and we talked about human behavior involving the use of power, making decisions for the larger group, and the struggle over who gets what, when, and how, and the focus on resources and the power to distribute them. The big ideas for today is how is politics done? And so how is it done by states, regimes, and governments? How do these three relate to each other and how do they influence politics? What is political legitimacy, and how do autonomy and capacity shape state power? So these ideas are brought to you by Max Weber, that handsome man that you see over there on the left of your screen. So Max Weber is considered sort of the grandfather of political science, and he's the one that started to think about politics systematically as the systematic study of politics instead of as this idea of statecraft. So he's the one that started defining systematically what the state is. So Weber says it's the monopoly of violence over a territory. And so there are a couple of parts of this that are important. And the first is territorial, right? And so there has to be some sort of physical land that an organization is claiming control over. And then you have the idea of monopoly of violence. And so monopoly of violence means that there's no organization inside that's trying to compete for control over violence with the military, right? And so there's no sort of strong militia, there's no strong guerrilla organization that has that's sort of claiming legitimacy of using violence in that territory. So when you see that happening, then you tend to call that like a failed state or a captured state. But this also means that nobody's attacking you from the outside, right? That you don't have any other organizations that have territorial claims on the territory you're defending, that nobody else is sort of trying to take over your territory. So you have the monopoly of violence inside that territory. So that's how Weber defines a state. So a state needs sovereignty, which means people need to protect and respect your boundaries and the ability to make decisions within that territory. And a state has the primary authority over both the territory and the people who live there. And so if you have large groups of people who don't recognize the validity of this state, then you have sort of contestations. And you see this lots of different places. So you see debates over this in Scotland in terms of whether Scotland should be independent. In Spain, you have the Catalan movement to secede from Spain. You see this lots of places in Russia and China. So there's constantly this struggle over whether or not territory should be divided and redivided, who should be in charge. But the idea is that you have a functioning state when it has primary authority over its territory and the people who live there. And so minimally, this authority means you have to be able to pass laws, protect rights, manage conflict, provide security, which means that a more robust definition of a state is as a bundle of political institutions that generate and enforce policy in order to provide this monopoly over violence. And so you have an army, you have police, you have taxation, a judiciary, a social welfare system. All of these are evolved in order to carry out the basic functions of a state. And all of them look different from country to country, but sort of minimally, these are the types of things that exist within a state. So then what is a regime? We tend to use these words interchangeably, and so does the media, which makes it really confusing. but it's helpful to talk about what the differences is. So the regime is the rules and norms of politics that are often embedded in the Constitution. And so the regime is basically the rules of the game. And so our Constitution sets up the way that our government's going to work in terms of the political institutions. It says, there's a separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judiciary. It creates a strong federalist government. All of these are the regime that we have. And so we have a democratic regime. And so the Constitution sets out long-term goals of individual freedom and equality, who holds power, how that power should be used. The basic regime types are democratic and non-democratic regimes. So most revolutions are against the current regime to change the rules of the game and replace them with new rules. And so if you have a religious revolution, oftentimes the goal is to target the current regime and make it more religious. If you have a social revolution, oftentimes the goal is to change the rules of the game and to to achieve some sort of just or equitable outcome in terms of the way your government functions. So if you have a state, which is an organization with the monopoly of power over a territory, you have a regime, which is sort of the way that the rules of the game, the way that political institutions operate over that territory. What is a government? So the government is the leadership that runs the state. It's limited by the regime type, and it consists of elected and or unelected officials. And so the government is the people who are carrying out what needs to be done in terms of the regime. And so, you have in the United States, the president, Congress, agency heads, the Supreme Court. All of those are part of the government. In a monarchy, the king or queen and the rest of the monarchs would be part of that. And so what I think one of the ways to think about it is that you can move from less institutionalized to more institutionalized. So remember, when we're talking about institutions, we're talking about rules of the game, the way that things function. And so when something is more institutionalized, it makes it harder to change, right? So it's very, very hard to change a state. Once you have a nation state, that's the hardest thing to change. And so, nation states change regime types over time. They go from being democratic to non-democratic. But they tend to keep what their territory is. A regime type is also harder to change than a government is, right? So we elect new governments every 4 years. We elect new representatives every 2 years. Other countries, overthrow the people that are in power, or they have elections to change who their leaders are as well. So a government is much less institutionalized, right? But the idea is that different people come and go, but our regime type looks basically the same. And even if we had some sort of anti-democratic revolution here, our state would still be the same. So the state is the most institutionalized, the government the least. Two other concepts that get thrown around are country and nation. So the country is everything that we're talking about. So the state, government, regime, and the people that live within that political system. And then a nation is a group of people who are bound together by a common set of political aspirations. So what we'll talk about in a few weeks is the idea of the nation state, which is the idea that people who have the same political aspirations or live within a single state, right? So one question is whether each individual nation deserves its own state, or whether you can have lots of different political and ethnic groups living within different states. And so these are two other concepts that I think help to complicate the idea of what it is that we're talking about. So in this class, a framework, the domestic level talks about things that happen within a state. The international level talks about things that happen between states. And then a transnational level talks about things that happen across states. So why do people form states in general, right? Why do we organize ourselves into states? And this is a question that we asked when we were talking about FLS Chapter 1, which is why have we arrived at the moment where nation states are the most popular? And the answer is because they're efficient, they create a shared sense of identity, they provide economic and developmental needs, technological innovation, and domestic and international security. So people organize one or two ways. The first way they organize is based on consensus. So individuals band together, create common rules, choose their own leaders, and provide security through cooperation, right? And so predominantly in democracies, would individuals choose to form a government together. They create and can change those rules. They choose their own leaders and can throw the bastards out if you don't like who they are. And they provide security through cooperation. And then you also have coercion. And so coercion is individuals who are brought together by a ruler who imposes authority and monopolizes power, and you have security through domination. So we tend to think of those as democratic rule versus authoritarian rule. And so under authoritarian rules, there's the strong imposition of authority, monopolization of power, there aren't elections, and security happens through domination. So the next question, and this is something that Max Weber also wrote a lot about, is the question of legitimacy. And so how do states have legitimacy? What does it mean for a government to be legitimate? And so Weber says that legitimacy is a value whereby people recognize and accept something as right and proper. And so, you accept that the person in charge ought to be the person making decisions, even when you disagree with them. You respect their right to make those decisions. There are three types of legitimacy that we tend to talk about: traditional, charismatic, and rational legal. So traditional legitimacy is strongly institutionalized. The idea is habit and custom over time. It stresses history. Charismatic legitimacy is the force of ideas and presence of the leader. And then rational legal legitimacy are based on the rules and procedures and the offices that create and enforce those rules. And so traditional legitimacy tends to be a monarch. And so think about Queen Elizabeth. And the idea is that, in monarchies and hereditary monarchies, there's something customary about it, right? It stresses history and it's very strongly institutionalized. And so even though the royal family in England, for example, has virtually no power, and most of the royal families in Europe have very, very little power at this point, there still is this sense that position is so institutionalized in society, they don't want to change it. Charismatic legitimacy tends to rest on not the strength of history or time or custom, but instead on the force of ideas, how charismatic the person in charge is. And so revolutionary heroes tend to be very charismatic. So Vladimir Lenin was extremely charismatic. Hugo Chavez was very charismatic. And so these are very weakly institutionalized because these people don't come to power based on either tradition or on being elected, but instead based on the force of their character. And they also tend to undermine institutions and say that mistakes, or that exceptions should be made. Finally, you have rational legal legitimacy, which is what we strive for in the United States and in developed democracies. And the idea is that you have elected executives. And so Angela Merkel was the elected executive of Germany. They had an election that followed the rules of the game that are set forth in German law. And then the person who lost respected the rules of those games. And so most democracies tend to warn pretty strongly against charismatic legitimacy and instead to focus on rational legal legitimacy. The states also involve power, right? Power, and the way that you can tell whether a state's strong or weak, depends on capacity and autonomy. So capacity is the ability of the state to wield power in order to carry out the basic tasks of providing security and reconciling freedom and equality. So capacity requires money, organization, and legitimacy. And then you have autonomy, which is the ability to wield power independently of the public, international actors, or other types of actors. And so when we talk about strong and weak states, we talk about how autonomous they are and also whether they have the capacity to make change. So a state that has to consult a group of people before making decisions is considered captured. So you see captured states quite a bit from time to time. If they're beholden to oil interests, for example, we consider those captured. If they're beholden to like a foreign power, we consider those to be captured states. So basically, states can fall into four categories: high capacity and high autonomy and low capacity and high autonomy, and low autonomy and low capacity. So think about what you know about these states and try to guess where you would put them. And one thing that I think is important is that capacity is good. High capacity is almost always good, and all states have that. All highly functional states have high capacity. High autonomy is not always an absolute good thing. Okay, so this is where these countries would go. So China has high autonomy and high capacity. And so the federal government in China makes decisions. There isn't a lot of decentralization of decision-making power to individual states. They also have pretty high capacity, and so they have the ability to sort of keep the lights on in all of the different corners of their country. Russia tends to have high autonomy and low capacity, particularly when you get outside of the cities. And so Russia tends to have high levels of poverty. And so even though, because they're an authoritarian regime, they have a lot of decision-making powers, they don't always have the ability to provide necessary resources for all of the rural parts of their country. The United States and Canada are low capacity, or low autonomy and high capacity, which might surprise some of you. But the reason is because of federalism and democracy, right? So because both of these are highly democratic countries, the executive is beholden to the people, but is also beholden to state governments, right? So the government is limited in what it can do based on what states can do. And then Nigeria and Afghanistan are both low autonomy and low capacity. So both of these countries have groups that are operating within them that challenge the rights of the government. And so you have Boko Haram in Nigeria, you have Al-Qaeda and other organizations, the United States military, things like that, in Afghanistan, and neither of these countries have high capacity. So neither of these can keep the lights on. So this chapter looked at sort of the basic building blocks of what you need to know in order to understand the way states function. So what is the state? What is the regime? What is the government? How institutionalized are these terms? Why do people organize themselves within states? How do we define and measure state power?